Before we transport you back to the fluorescent aisles of 1983, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden histories of the Cold War and the ordinary people who found themselves on the front lines of espionage, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us bring these forgotten files into the light. The year was 1983. The location was a sprawling suburb of Northern Virginia, just far enough from Washington, D.C. to feel like a neighborhood, but close enough that the morning commute was a river of red taillights heading toward the Pentagon and the Capitol. The epicenter of this particular drama, however, was not a government building or a military base. It was the Foodland supermarket on Elm Street. For Betty Miller, life was measured in the rhythmic beep of the optical scanner and the slide of conveyor belts. Betty was 52 years old, a woman of practical sensibilities who wore her hair in a tight perm and her Foodland smock with a distinct sense of professional pride. She had worked at the supermarket for 12 years. She knew which customers clipped coupons. She knew who was buying formula for a new baby, and she knew who was drinking too much cheap scotch on a Tuesday night. The supermarket was the great equalizer of American life. Everyone had to eat. In the early 1980s, the aisles were stocked with new wonders, frozen dinners that heated up in minutes, sodas in plastic bottles, and an endless variety of breakfast cereals. To an outsider, it was a temple of excess. To Betty, it was just Tuesday. It was a slow morning in late October when he first came through her line. He was a man of average height, perhaps in his early 40s, with the kind of face that was handsome but instantly forgettable. He wore a tan raincoat, the sort that was popular with government types, and his hair was combed in a neat, unassuming side part. "Good morning," Betty said, her voice carrying that practiced, sing-song lilt of customer service. "Did you find everything all right today?" "Yes, thank you," the man said. His voice was smooth, deep, and possessed a generic American accent that sounded like it belonged to a news anchor from nowhere in particular. It was the kind of voice you heard on the radio. Clear, enunciated, and completely devoid of regional character. He placed his items on the belt with unusual precision. Most people threw their groceries down, cans rolling into boxes, vegetables crushed by milk jugs. This man placed a box of crackers, then a jar of peanut butter, then a carton of eggs, aligning them as if he were building a small wall. Betty began scanning. "Paper or plastic?" "Paper is fine," he said. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, watching the numbers rise on the digital register. "Bit of a chill out there today, isn't there?" Betty asked, making the standard small talk that filled the silence of the transaction. "They say we might get frost tonight." The man looked at the glass doors at the front of the store. "Yes, the temperature is appropriate for the season." Betty paused for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over a can of soup. It wasn't a strange answer exactly. It was grammatically correct. It was polite, but it felt stiff. Most people would say, "Yeah, freezing my tail off," or "I'm not ready for winter." To call the temperature appropriate for the season sounded like something she would read in a textbook. "Well, I've got my tomato plants covered just in case," Betty said, finishing the order. "That'll be $18.42. The man produced a wallet. It was leather, new-looking. He extracted a $20 bill. It was crisp, not just bank fresh, but stiff, as if it had never been folded into a pocket or crumpled in a glove compartment. "Thank you," he said as she handed him the change. He picked up his single paper bag, carrying it from the bottom rather than the handles, and walked out. Betty watched him go. There was nothing suspicious about him. He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't been rude. He was just distinct. In a world of messy, tired, chatty suburbanites, he was perfectly composed. She shrugged, turned to the next customer, Mrs. Higgins, who was buying cat food again, and forgot about him. But he would be back, and it was in the repetition, in the routine, that the cracks would eventually begin to show. Over the next 3 weeks, the man became a regular. Betty learned that his routine was as precise as his grocery stacking. He came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always between 10 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. This was the lull period, after the morning rush of parents dropping kids off at school and before the lunch crowd drifted in from the nearby office parks. He never bought much. Bread, milk, cheese, canned vegetables. He never bought fun food. No impulse buys of candy bars at the register, no magazines, no seasonal decorations. He shopped like a man who was fueling a machine rather than feeding a human being. Betty, being the kind of woman who treated her register as a social hub, tried to engage him each time. It was part of her nature, but it was also a game she played to pass the time. She wanted to crack the shell of the polite man in the tan coat. "I see you're buying the generic corn," Betty noted one Thursday, sliding the white can with black lettering across the scanner. "The Green Giant is on sale, you know. 2 for $1. Better deal." The man looked at the generic can, then at the display of name-brand corn at the end of the aisle. He seemed to calculate something in his head. "This one is sufficient," he said. "The nutritional content is identical." "I suppose," Betty laughed. "But the taste, honey, you gotta have the flavor. But hey, the customer is always right." He offered a tight, brief smile. "Economy is important." "Tell me about it," Betty sighed. "With these interest rates? My husband Bob, he's been trying to refinance the truck, and let me tell you, the bank is squeezing us dry. You finding the same thing?" The man blinked. For a second, the mask of pleasant indifference slipped, replaced by a look of genuine processing. He looked like a computer trying to access a file that wasn't there. "The banks," he said slowly, "are indeed rigorous." "Rigorous," Betty repeated. "Yeah, that's one word for it. I call it highway robbery." He nodded once sharply. "Yes, robbery." He paid with another crisp $20 bill. Later that afternoon, Betty was on her break in the employee lounge, smoking a cigarette and drinking coffee that tasted like burnt pennies. Her friend Marge, who worked the bakery counter, sat down opposite her. "Who's the stiff in aisle 4? Marge asked. "I see him come through your line. Never says a word to me when he walks past the donuts." "Who doesn't look at donuts?" "I don't know his name," Betty said. "He never pays by check, always cash, always fresh bills." "Drug dealer?" Marge joked, taking a bite of a cruller. "No," Betty shook her head. "Too clean. He dresses like he's going to church, but he buys groceries like he's stocking a bomb shelter. Just basics. And he talks funny." "Funny how? Foreign?" "No, not foreign," Betty frowned, trying to place it. "He sounds American. He just sounds like he learned how to talk from reading the dictionary. He called the bank rigorous." "Who says that?" "Maybe he's a professor," Marge suggested. "From the community college." "Maybe," Betty said, stubbing out her cigarette. "But professors usually have stains on their jackets, ink or chalk. This guy is spotless. It's weird, Marge, it's just weird." The following Tuesday, the man returned. The store was busy this time. A delivery truck had been late, and the aisles were crowded with restocking carts. The man seemed agitated by the disorder. He stood near the dairy section, waiting for a stock boy to move a pallet of milk crates. He didn't say, "Excuse me," or maneuver his cart around. He just stood there waiting, checking his watch. When he finally reached Betty's register, he looked relieved. "Busy day," Betty said. "Sorry about the wait." "Inefficiency is frustrating," he murmured. "You're telling me," Betty said. "So, you getting ready for the big game on Sunday?" The Washington Redskins were playing the Dallas Cowboys. In Northern Virginia in 1983, this was not just a game, it was a religious event. Burgundy and gold flags were flying from every porch. The cashier stations were draped in streamers. Even the manager, Mr. Henderson, was wearing a Redskins tie. The man looked at Betty, then at the football helmet cutout hanging above the register. "The game," he said. "Yes. It should be a significant contest." "Significant contest?" Betty chuckled. "I hope we crush them. I hate the Cowboys. My husband says if Theismann throws another interception, he's going to put his foot through the TV." The man stared at her blankly. The name Theismann, Joe Theismann, the quarterback, the hero of the city, clearly meant nothing to him. He didn't react with recognition. He didn't nod. "Sports are unpredictable," he said finally. Betty finished bagging his groceries. "You aren't a football fan, are you?" "I prefer chess," he said. "Chess," Betty said. "Well, that figures." As he walked away, Betty watched him again. It wasn't that he didn't like football. Plenty of people didn't like football. It was that he didn't seem to understand the energy of it. He treated the question about the game as a factual inquiry rather than a cultural bond. He was missing the rhythm. Betty tore the receipt tape from the machine. She didn't know it yet, but she had just found the first loose thread in a tapestry of lies that spanned 2 continents. The turning point, the moment where weird turned into suspicious, happened over a jar of pickles. It was the second week of November. The promotional flyers for Thanksgiving were out, splashing bright orange pumpkins and golden turkeys across the front pages of the local papers. Foodland was running a special: buy 1 jar of Vlasic pickles, get a second one for a penny. The man in the tan coat placed 2 jars of pickles on the belt. Betty scanned them. The register rang up the first jar at full price and the second jar at full price. The computer system in 1983 was not always reliable, and the promotional code hadn't been programmed in yet for the morning shift. "Oh, hang on," Betty said. "The machine didn't catch the deal. Let me override it." She keyed in the manual code, waiting for the manager's key, but Mr. Henderson was nowhere to be found. "I'm sorry," Betty said. "I can't get the penny deal to work right this second without the manager's key. But tell you what, I can give you a rain check." The man froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his wallet, stopped in midair. He looked at Betty, then he looked at the ceiling of the store, and then he looked out the front windows toward the parking lot. It was a bright sunny day, not a cloud in the sky. "A rain check?" he asked. His voice had a sudden, sharp edge of confusion. "Yeah," Betty said, grabbing a small pad of yellow slips from under the counter. "I'll write it up for you. You can come back next time and get the pickles for the sale price, since I can't do it right now." The man stared at the yellow pad. The confusion on his face was genuine. He was processing the words literally. Rain. Check. He was checking for rain, but there was no rain. The idiom, a uniquely American phrase derived from baseball games being canceled due to weather, was completely foreign to him. "But it is not raining," he said. Betty paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't just being stiff. This was a gap in basic cultural knowledge. Even a child knew what a rain check was. "It's just an expression, honey," Betty said slowly. "It means you get the deal later." The man's eyes darted left and right, a micro-expression of panic that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He realized he had made a mistake. He realized he had exposed a gap. "Of course," he said quickly. A little too quickly. "I was making a joke. Humor, because of the clear sky." He laughed. It was a terrible sound, a short staccato ha-ha that didn't reach his eyes. "Right," Betty said. She didn't smile. "A joke." She wrote out the slip and handed it to him. He took it with 2 fingers, as if it were radioactive material, and shoved it deep into his pocket. He didn't buy the pickles. He left them there. "I will decline the purchase today," he said. "I do not need them urgently." He paid for his other items, bread, milk, a bag of apples, and left the store with a pace that was noticeably faster than his usual stroll. Betty watched him go. Her heart was beating a little faster. She had worked in this store for a dozen years. She had met immigrants learning English. She had met tourists. She had met people who were slow on the uptake. But this man spoke perfect English. He knew words like inefficiency and rigorous, yet he didn't know what a rain check was. She closed her register lane. "Where you going, Betty?" Marge called out from the bakery. "Bathroom," Betty lied. She went to the manager's office at the front of the store. The office had a large window that overlooked the parking lot. She stood behind the blinds, peering out through the slats. She saw the man in the tan coat walking toward a blue Ford sedan. He didn't get in immediately. He stood by the trunk, looking around the parking lot. He scanned the perimeter, checking the other cars, checking the roof of the store. It was a counter-surveillance check, though Betty didn't know the term. She just knew he looked like a man making sure he wasn't being followed. He got into the car. Betty squinted, trying to read the license plate. She grabbed a pen from the manager's desk and wrote it down on the back of her hand. VR492L. She didn't know why she did it. It felt silly. It felt like something from the spy novels she read on her lunch break. But the rain check moment sat in her stomach like a cold stone. Something was wrong with Mr. Tan Coat. That evening, Betty sat at her kitchen table. Her husband, Bob, was watching the news in the living room. The report was about tensions in Europe, about missiles and treaties and the endless stare-down between Reagan and Andropov. "Bob," Betty called out. "If someone speaks perfect English but doesn't know what a rain check is, where are they from?" "Mars," Bob grunted, not looking away from the TV. Betty looked at the number written on her hand. She had transferred it to a piece of notepad paper. She picked up the heavy phone book, the yellow pages, and flipped to the government section. She found the number for the local police. She dialed. "Arlington Police, Sergeant Miller," a voice answered. "Hi," Betty said. "This is going to sound crazy, but I think I want to report a suspicious person." "Okay, ma'am. What did he do? Did he threaten you?" "No," Betty said. "He's a customer at the supermarket where I work. Foodland. He comes in twice a week. He's strange." "Strange how, ma'am? Is he intoxicated?" "No," Betty struggled to explain. "He acts like a robot. He doesn't know about football. He doesn't know what a rain check is. And today, I saw him checking the parking lot like he was scared of being followed." There was a long silence on the other end. Betty could practically hear the officer rolling his eyes. "Ma'am, it's not a crime to not like football or understand a coupon. Unless he's harassing you or stealing, there's not much we can do." "I have his license plate," Betty said. "Look, ma'am, we're busy. If he does something illegal, call us back." The line went dead. Betty hung up. She felt foolish. Bob was right. She was imagining things. He was probably just an eccentric guy. Maybe he was homeschooled. Maybe he was Amish and had left the community. But the next morning, Betty couldn't let it go. She went to the public library before her shift. She went to the reference section and asked for the reverse directory, a book that allowed you to look up addresses by license plate if you knew the county codes, though it was often outdated. She couldn't find the plate. She went to work, determined to just do her job. But at 10:15 a.m. on Thursday, he was there again. This time, Betty didn't try to make small talk. She just watched. She watched his hands. They were calloused, but not from manual labor. They were calloused on the fingertips. He bought a newspaper, the Washington Post, and a box of chalk. "Just the chalk and the paper?" Betty asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Yes," he said. "Planning to draw some hopscotch?" she asked, testing him again. He looked at the box of white sidewalk chalk. "For marking," he said. "Construction. At home." "Right," Betty said. He left. Betty turned to the bag boy, a teenager named Jimmy. "Jimmy, do me a favor," she whispered. "Go out there and see where he goes. Don't let him see you." "Are you serious, Mrs. Miller?" "Go! I'll give you a candy bar." Jimmy ran out. He came back 3 minutes later, breathless. "He didn't leave," Jimmy whispered. He walked to the telephone pole on the corner of the lot. He drew a mark on it with the chalk, a white X. Then he got in his car and left. Betty felt a chill run down her spine. A white X. A signal. She wasn't calling the police this time. She went back to the employee lounge and found the phone book again. She didn't look for the police. She looked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI field office in Washington, D.C. received thousands of calls a month. Most were cranks. People reporting that their neighbors were beaming radio waves into their brains, or that the mailman was a communist because he delivered the mail late. When the call from Betty Miller came in, it was routed to the General Inquiries desk, which was essentially the trash bin for low-priority tips. It was answered by Special Agent David Carter. Carter was 28, fresh out of Quantico, and stuck on desk duty because he had messed up a surveillance log the week before. "FBI Agent Carter." "My name is Betty Miller," the voice said. She sounded nervous but firm. "I work at the Foodland in Arlington. I think there is a Soviet spy shopping in my store." Carter sighed, rubbing his temples. "Okay, Ms. Miller. Why do you think he's a spy? Is he wearing a fur hat?" "No," Betty said sharply. "He's wearing a tan raincoat. He speaks perfect English, but he doesn't understand idioms. He called a rain check a weather event. He doesn't know who Joe Theismann is. And today, he marked a telephone pole with a white chalk X after buying nothing but the chalk and a newspaper." Carter stopped rubbing his temples. The chalk mark. That was specific. That was tradecraft. It was rudimentary, old school. but it was exactly the kind of life sign signal agents use to indicate a drop was ready or a meeting was confirmed. "He marked a pole?" Carter asked, sitting up straighter. "Where?" "Corner of Elm and Sycamore, the edge of the Foodland lot." Did you get a plate?" "VR492L, blue Ford." Carter wrote it down. "Hold on, Ms. Miller." He put her on hold and ran the plate through the NCIC terminal. The computer hummed and spat out green text. "Vehicle registered to Arthur Vance. Address 422 Oak Lane, Alexandria. Employment, import-export consultant." It looked clean, too clean. Import-export was the classic cover for someone who didn't want to explain where their money came from. But the name Arthur Vance didn't flag in any criminal database. Carter picked up the line. "Ms. Miller, has he ever spoken to anyone else in the store?" "No, he comes in alone. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 a.m. sharp." "Okay," Carter said. "Here's what I want you to do. Nothing. Do not talk to him. Do not ask him about rain checks. Treat him like any other customer. Can you do that?" "I can," Betty said. "But you need to come see him. He's not right. I'm telling you, he's a fake." "We'll look into it," Carter said. He hung up. He looked at the notes. A chalk mark. A misunderstanding of American slang. It was thin. It was incredibly thin. But it was also the only interesting thing that had crossed his desk in a week. He walked over to his supervisor, Section Chief Reynolds. "Boss," Carter said, "I got a tip from a grocery store clerk. Claims a guy is marking signal sites and acting like a pod person." Reynolds didn't look up from his paperwork. And she got a plate. "Guy is a ghost. Import, export. Lives in Alexandria. I want to take a ride out there." Reynolds looked at him. "You want to stake out a grocery store because a cashier thinks a guy is weird?" She said he didn't know what a rain check was. Reynolds paused. He frowned. "Who doesn't know what a rain check is?" "Exactly," Carter said. "Take Henderson with you," Reynolds said. "Don't burn the guy. Just watch." The following Tuesday, the Foodland supermarket had two new shoppers. Agent Carter and Agent Henderson were dressed in civilian clothes. Carter was wearing a windbreaker and jeans, pushing a cart with a few random items in it. Henderson, an older, gruffer agent, was pretending to read the ingredients on a box of cereal in aisle 3. Betty was at her register. She was sweating. Her hands were shaking slightly. She had been told to act normal, but normal was hard when you knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation was watching you work. At 10:03 a.m., Arthur Vance walked in. He looked exactly the same. Tan coat, neat hair, blank expression. He picked up a basket. Carter watched him from the reflection of a convex security mirror in the corner of the produce section. Vance moved with efficiency. He selected 3 apples. He checked them for bruises with the intensity of a diamond appraiser. He moved to the canned goods. He picked up a can of soup. He held it for a moment, then put it back. He picked up another can, identical brand, identical flavor, and put it in his basket. "Did you see that?" Carter whispered into the small microphone concealed in his collar. "Yeah," Henderson replied from the cereal aisle. "Switching cans." "Why?" Vance moved to the baking aisle. He bought a bag of flour. Then he went to the register. Betty's heart hammered against her ribs. She forced a smile. "Morning," she said. "Good morning," Vance said. "Find everything okay?" "Yes." Betty scanned the apples. She scanned the flour. She scanned the can of soup. As she picked up the can of soup, her thumb brushed against the bottom. It felt different. The metal rim was slightly uneven. It wasn't a factory seal, it was a micro-seam. She wanted to look at it. She wanted to scream, but she just beeped it through and bagged it. $12 even, she said. Vance paid. He took his bag and left. "He's moving," Carter said into his mic. "I'm on him." Carter abandoned his cart and followed Vance out the door. Henderson was already in the parking lot, sitting in an unmarked sedan. Vance didn't go to his car immediately. He walked to the payphone bank outside the store. He didn't make a call. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of colored tape, red electrical tape. He stuck it to the bottom of the metal shelf under the phone. Then he walked to his car and drove away. Carter ran to the payphone. He reached under the shelf. He felt the tape. He peeled it back. Under the tape was a tiny magnetic metal container, no bigger than a thimble. Carter opened it. Inside was a sliver of microfilm. He looked at Henderson, who had pulled the car up to the curb. "We got him," Carter said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. The cashier was right. We got a live one. The investigation exploded. Within 48 hours, the FBI had full surveillance on Arthur Vance. His real name, they would later discover, was Alexei Volkov. He was a KGB sleeper agent who had been inserted into the United States in 1978. His legend, his fake identity, was meticulously crafted. He had a birth certificate from a town in Ohio whose records had been destroyed in a fire. He had a social security number from a dead child. But for all his training, for all the millions of rubles spent on his cover, he had a fatal flaw. He had learned American culture from books and tapes. He knew the laws, the geography, and the language. But he didn't know the soul of the country. He didn't know the casual, messy, illogical way Americans spoke and interacted. He was a man playing a role, but he had never learned to improvise. The microfilm found under the payphone contained photographs of classified naval schematics. Volkov was running a source inside the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. He was using the supermarket as a transfer point. He would buy groceries to establish a pattern, then mark the signal site, the chalk on the pole, the tape on the phone, to let his handler know the drop was made. The can of soup Betty had scanned, the FBI intercepted it later that day after raiding his trash. It had a false bottom. Inside were decrypted instructions for the next drop. Betty Miller was brought into the field office for a formal interview. She sat in a sterile room, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup. "You have a good eye, Ms. Miller," Section Chief Reynolds told her. "Better than some of my agents." "He just didn't fit," Betty said. "It's hard to explain. When you stand at a register for 8 hours a day, you see the rhythm of people. You see how they live. This man, he wasn't living. He was performing. We're going to keep watching him," Reynolds said. "We want to catch his contact, the person he's passing the info to. We need you to keep ringing him up. Can you do that?" "Will he know?" Betty asked. "No. He thinks he's invisible. He thinks you're just a cashier." Betty straightened her smock. "All right, I'll do it, but I'm not giving him any more coupons." The operation came to a head the week of Thanksgiving. The FBI had identified Volkov's handler, a diplomat from the Soviet embassy named Sergei Kornilov. They knew a major exchange was planned. The drop was going to happen inside the supermarket. On the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, the store was chaos. People were fighting over turkeys. The aisles were jammed with carts. It was the perfect cover for a clandestine exchange. Volkov entered at 10 a.m. He was tense. The holiday crowd disrupted his precision. He moved to the cereal aisle. Agent Carter was stocking shelves, dressed as a Foodland employee. He watched as Volkov picked up a box of Frosted Flakes. He didn't put it in his basket. He placed it back on the shelf, but he turned it sideways, so the narrow edge faced out. Then he walked away. 10 minutes later, a second man entered, Sergei Kornilov. He was dressed in a jogging suit, trying to look casual. He walked to the cereal aisle. He reached for the sideways box of Frosted Flakes. "FBI, don't move!" The shout cut through the ambient noise of the supermarket like a gunshot. Agents swarmed from everywhere. Carter jumped over a display of stuffing mix. Henderson emerged from the butcher counter. Uniformed officers burst through the front doors. Kornilov dropped the cereal box. It hit the floor and burst open. Inside, amidst the sugar-coated flakes, was a thick envelope sealed with wax. Volkov, who was in the checkout line, tried to run. He bolted toward the automatic doors. Betty Miller was standing at register 3. She saw him coming. She saw the panic in his eyes. The smooth robotic mask was gone, replaced by the terrified face of a man whose world was collapsing. He crashed into a cart being pushed by an elderly woman. He stumbled. Before he could recover, 3 agents were on top of him. They pinned him to the linoleum floor, right in front of the gum and candy racks. "Alexei Volkov, you are under arrest for espionage." The supermarket went silent. The shoppers froze. The muzak, a soft instrumental version of Yesterday, continued to play over the speakers. Volkov lay on the floor, his cheek pressed against the cold tile. He looked up. He locked eyes with Betty. He didn't look angry. He looked confused. He looked like he still couldn't understand how he had been caught. He had done everything right. He had followed the manual. Betty looked down at him. She shook her head. "It's called a rain check, honey," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. "Look it up." The arrest of the supermarket spy made the evening news, though the details were vague. The government didn't want to admit that a Soviet agent had been operating in the suburbs for 5 years. They certainly didn't want to admit that he was caught because he didn't understand a coupon. Volkov and Kornilov were interrogated. Volkov eventually cooperated, trading secrets for a life sentence instead of the electric chair. He was later exchanged in 1986 for 2 American journalists held in Moscow. Betty Miller went back to work the next day. She had to. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and it was the busiest day of the year. The store was buzzing with rumors. Everyone wanted to talk to her. "Did you see the gun? Did you know he was a commie?" Betty didn't say much. She just kept scanning. Beep, slide, beep, slide. But things were different now. She looked at her customers differently. The quiet man buying cat litter, the woman with the sunglasses buying aspirin, the teenager buying energy drinks. Were they just people? Or were they actors? She realized that the Cold War wasn't just fought with missiles and tanks. It was fought in the gaps between words. It was fought in the small cultural understandings that defined a nation. To be an American wasn't just about paperwork. It was about knowing that a rain check wasn't about the weather, that you complained about the bank even if you had money, and that you pretended to care about the football game even if you preferred chess. It was a code, a secret language that 250 million people spoke without thinking. And Volkov, for all his training, never learned the grammar. A month later, a letter arrived at Betty's house. It had no return address. Inside was a simple Christmas card and a check for $5,000. The note was typed, "Ms. Miller, the United States government thanks you for your vigilance. Your observation of the rain check anomaly was the key to unraveling a significant security threat. Please accept this as a token of gratitude. Regards, a friend." Betty showed it to Bob. $5,000, Bob whistled. "That's a new truck." "It's hush money," Betty said. "Or thank you money, I don't care." She put the check in her purse. "You know," Bob said, "you were right about the rain check." "I know I was right," Betty said. She went to the kitchen and looked out the window. It was snowing, a light dusting covering the suburban lawns. She thought about Volkov. She wondered where he was. A federal prison cell, probably. Cold and gray. She wondered if he finally understood the irony. He had been taken down not by a supercomputer, not by a satellite, not by a double agent. He had been taken down by a 50-year-old woman in a polyester smock who just wanted to make small talk. The supermarket was a fortress of democracy in its own way, and Betty Miller was its guardian. Years passed. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. Betty eventually retired from Foodland. The store was remodeled. The old registers were replaced with laser scanners. The payphone outside was removed. But the story of the spy in aisle 4 became a local legend. New cashiers were told the story during training. "Watch the customers," the managers would say. "You never know who you're ringing up." Betty died in 2005. At her funeral, a man in a black suit stood in the back. He didn't sign the guest book. He didn't speak to the family. When the service was over, he walked up to the casket. He placed a single item on the polished wood. It was a jar of Vlasic pickles. He walked away before anyone could ask him who he was. Was it Agent Carter? Was it someone else? No one knew. But the message was clear. In the grand, terrifying, complex chess game of global espionage, the pawns are sometimes the most dangerous pieces on the board. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon in the arsenal is simply asking, "How about this weather?" The Foodland on Elm Street is gone now. It's a condominium complex. The world has moved on to cyber warfare and digital surveillance. Spies don't need dead drops in cereal boxes anymore. They hack servers from laptops in cafes. But the lesson remains. We reveal ourselves in the small things, in our idioms, our complaints, our habits. We are defined by the culture we breathe. And somewhere, right now, In a coffee shop or a grocery store or a gas station, someone is pretending to be something they are not. They are rehearsing their lines. They are checking their posture. But they are terrified. They are terrified that a Betty Miller is watching. They are terrified that they will miss a cue. They are terrified that someone will ask them a question that isn't in the manual. Paper or plastic? How about them cowboys? Do you have a rain check? The questions are simple. The answers are everything. So the next time you're at the checkout counter, take a look at the person in front of you. Listen to their voice. Watch their hands. Are they buying milk and bread? Or are they building a cover? You never know. The Cold War may be over, but the game never ends.